The world would come to know her as Belle Gunness, the monstrous Lady Bluebeard of Porte, Indiana. But the killer's narrative began far across the Atlantic, on a small, unforgiving farm in Selbu, Norway. She was born Brynhild Paulsdatter Sturseth in 1859, the youngest of 8 children, and her early life was defined by the harsh, relentless poverty common to Norwegian tenants of the era. The Sturseth family worked the rocky, meager soil, often teetering on the edge of starvation. This childhood scarcity would forge in Brynhild a fierce, almost obsessive drive for material security, a drive that would eventually consume her soul. Her transformation from a struggling farm girl to a cold-blooded killer is often traced back to a specific, deeply scarring incident in her late teens. Pregnant by a local man, Brynhild was allegedly attacked and brutally kicked in the abdomen during a heated argument at a dance. The assault, according to some accounts, caused her to miscarry and critically left her with a deep, consuming hatred and resentment toward men who held power over her and her body. While the true extent of the damage is debated, what remains clear is that the incident marked a turning point, embedding a core of bitterness and a desire for absolute control. The opportunity for escape came in 1881. Like thousands of Scandinavians seeking a better life, Brynhild left the restrictive confines of Selbu, joining her sister in America. She carried with her not just a few possessions, but a complete rejection of the poverty and helplessness of her past. She settled first in Chicago, the booming, chaotic heart of the New World. Here she began the careful process of reinvention. The sturdy, country name, Brynhild Paulsdatter Sturseth, was shed, replaced by the more Americanized Belle. She was a physically imposing woman, standing over 5 feet 7 inches tall and powerfully built, traits that would later prove useful for her murderous work. In 1884, she married Mads Ditlev Anton Sorensen, a fellow Norwegian immigrant who worked as a tailor. Together, they opened a confectionery shop, finally achieving the modest security Brynhild craved. But tragedy, or perhaps the first glimpse of her criminal pattern, soon followed. The couple's business struggled, and 2 of their 4 children died in infancy, both from stomach ailments often associated with poisoning. Crucially, the children's lives were heavily insured. Following their deaths, Belle and Mads collected on the policies, giving them the capital they desperately needed. The pattern solidified on July 30th, 1900. Mads Sorensen died suddenly, officially from a stroke. Neighbors, however, noted Belle's disturbing eagerness to call the doctor only after Mads was already dead, and her immediate attempts to cremate the body. The coroner initially ruled it a death from natural causes, but 2 months later, under pressure from Mads' family, a second inquiry was held. Though no charges were filed, the second inquiry ruled that Mads had died of strychnine poisoning. Yet, once again, Belle collected the insurance money, an astonishing $8,500. It was the payout she needed. With the stench of suspicion rising in Chicago, Belle Gunness, now a wealthy widow, decided it was time for another clean slate. She purchased a substantial farm in Porte, Indiana, effectively moving her dark ambitions out of the scrutiny of the big city and into the rural isolation. That would become the setting for her most horrific crimes. The transformation was complete. The timid Norwegian immigrant was now the bold, calculating Belle Gunness, ready to begin her reign of terror. This story continues the Belle Gunness narrative from the previous section. Belle Gunness's move from the challenging farm life of Norway to to the bustling, industrialized Chicago was her first act of reinvention. But her second was far more sinister: the systematic use of tragedy for financial gain. The seeds of her murder-for-profit scheme were sown in the simple confectionery shop she operated with her first husband, Mads Ditlev Anton Sorensen, near the turn of the century. Belle, always keenly aware of money, watched their business efforts flounder, fostering the dangerous idea that death was a more reliable source of income than labor. The pattern began with the most vulnerable victims, her own children. 2 of the Sorensen infants died mysteriously. Though often attributed to the high rates of childhood mortality of the era, the circumstances raised suspicion. Both children had been heavily insured, and Belle quickly collected the payouts. To a cash-strapped immigrant family, these funds, though small, were a profound lifeline. Belle absorbed a chilling lesson: death paid dividends. The turning point, the incident that truly established Belle's lethal pattern, is the suspicious fate of the family's confectionery shop itself. In 1898, the shop suddenly burned to the ground. Fire in 19th century Chicago was not uncommon, but the timing was impeccable. The business had been struggling, and following the blaze, Belle and Mads collected the insurance money. This incident cemented her understanding that destruction could be leveraged into wealth, a lesson she would later apply to human lives. However, the most financially rewarding and damning event of her Chicago years was the death of Mads Sorensen himself on July 30th, 1900. Mads died on the single day when his life insurance policies overlapped, creating a temporary period where 2 large policies were active simultaneously. Belle, ever the meticulous planner, had ensured the timing was perfect. Mads' official cause of death was attributed to a cerebral hemorrhage. However, his family was immediately suspicious. They noted the speed with which Belle attempted to have the body cremated, which would have destroyed any evidence. They also remembered that Mads had recently complained to them that his wife was trying to poison him. Driven by these fears, Mads' relatives succeeded in halting the cremation and demanded an investigation. The first coroner's inquiry was inconclusive, but Belle, using her considerable charm and perhaps intimidation, managed to secure the $8,500 insurance payout. This massive sum, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars today, represented the financial freedom she had been seeking her entire life. However, Mads' family continued to press the issue. A second inquiry was held, led by the district attorney. Several key pieces of evidence were revealed. Mads had not been ill prior to his death, and symptoms described by a doctor who saw the body were consistent with strychnine poisoning, not a stroke. The inquiry's official verdict was chilling. Mads Sorensen had died of strychnine poisoning. The cause was unknown, presumably self-administered. Crucially, while the verdict strongly suggested murder, no direct evidence tied Belle to administering the poison, and she was never charged. She emerged from the tragedy officially a free, wealthy widow, but privately a successful predator. The ashes of her shop and the suspicious death of her husband provided her with the capital and the confidence to take her lethal operation to the next level. Chicago had provided the training ground. The isolated fields of LaPorte, Indiana, would soon provide the hunting ground. With the $8,500 safely in hand, Belle Gunness turned her back on Chicago, leaving behind a trail of death, fire, and unanswered questions. She sought a place where the scrutiny of city officials could be traded for the seclusion of the countryside. place where a wealthy, seemingly pious widow could carry out her deadly plans undisturbed. The year 1901 marked a critical escalation in Belle's dark career. Armed with the substantial insurance money from Mads Sorensen's death, she understood that the crowded scrutiny of Chicago was a liability. The solution was the country, a place where a lone, wealthy woman could manage her affairs and her crimes without the constant gaze of neighbors and authorities. Her chosen refuge was a sprawling 48-acre property just outside Porte, Indiana. This farm, a mixture of fields, thickets, and deep ravines, offered the perfect blend of respectability and isolation. She purchased the land immediately, projecting the image of a successful, hard-working widow seeking a quiet life. The local community saw a robust, pious woman focused on raising her children, a portrait of virtuous American motherhood. No one suspected that this farm was less a home and more a specially designed killing ground. Soon after settling in, Belle married her second husband, Peter Gunness. In 1902, Peter was another Norwegian immigrant, a kind, simple-minded butcher with two young daughters of his own.
The marriage was short-lived and served only two purposes for Belle: to provide her with a new, respectable surname, and to provide her with another victim.
Barely a week after marrying, Peter's infant daughter, Susie, died mysteriously while in Belle's care. Then, in December 1902, only 8 months into the marriage, Peter Gunness suffered a violent, fatal accident. Belle claimed a meat grinder had fallen from a high shelf and crushed Peter's skull. Locals, however, were skeptical. The timing just after Peter had secured a significant life insurance policy was too convenient. Peter's daughter, Jenny, later recounted seeing Belle strike her father with a cleaver. The coroner initially bought Belle's story, though not without suspicion. She managed to avoid charges, but she had secured another $4,000 in insurance money. She was now a two-time widow, wealthier and more brazen than ever. With Peter gone, Belle became the sole proprietor of the Porte farm. The isolation was secured. But farming was hard work, and Belle did not intend to earn her living by the sweat of her brow. She devised a brilliant, cruel new plan that leveraged the emotional desperation of the age. The target market: lonely, single, and financially secure men from across the Midwest and Norway. The bait was placed in the classified sections of major regional newspapers. A good woman seeking a partner to share her comfortable home and wealth, be financially sound and willing to marry. These were the infamous matrimonial advertisements. They were crafted to perfection, portraying Belle as a lonely, domesticated, pious woman, eager for love and commitment, crucially, ready to share her wealth. To the heartbroken and solitary men reading the papers, the advertisement was a beacon of hope. Belle meticulously screened the replies, searching for two specific traits: loneliness and, more importantly, proof of funds. She required her suitors to bring all their savings and assets with them, explaining that she didn't trust banks and they could invest the money in their future together. The trap was set. The farm, once a symbol of the American dream, was ready to receive its unsuspecting, cash-carrying victims. The success of Belle Gunness' macabre enterprise rested entirely on her ability to craft a convincing illusion. After securing the Porte farm and dispensing with Peter Gunness, she perfected her tool of choice: the matrimonial advertisement. These small, unassuming notices placed in newspapers across the Midwest were the ultimate bait, targeting a specific, vulnerable demographic: lonely, middle-aged men with cash and no immediate family ties. Belle's advertisements were masterpieces of manipulative psychology. They painted her as a woman of virtue, piety, and comfortable means the ideal, stable partner in an age of rapid social change. She was not seeking a handout. She was seeking companionship and a man who understood the value of land and investment. The responses she received were numerous, but Belle was a demanding editor. She carefully filtered the hundreds of letters for two non-negotiable criteria: financial solvency and a genuine depth of loneliness. She preferred widowers and men who had little contact with their distant relatives, ensuring that their sudden disappearance would not immediately trigger alarm bells. Once a promising prospect was identified, the real work of deception began. Belle's letters were masterful, weaving a narrative of earnest affection and shared values. Her handwriting was neat, her tone warm, and her language deeply sentimental. Playing directly on the emotional needs of her isolated correspondents, she wrote of her struggles as a widow, her love for her children, and her longing for a true partner. "I have been so lonely since my husband passed," she might write, "and I pray that God has brought us together. I have a lovely farm, but I need a strong man to share it with me, someone kind and honest. I'm not looking for a fortune, only a good, reliable man." Crucially, as the correspondence deepened, Belle would introduce the financial requirement. She would explain, often with a fabricated story of bank instability or distrust of city institutions, that she wished her future husband to bring all his liquid assets, his life savings, banknotes, or property deeds with him. This wasn't because she was greedy, she insisted, but because she wanted to invest the money in their joint future, perhaps expanding the farm or buying new equipment. The money was to be the foundation of their happiness. The letters were calculated to strip away the men's inherent caution. She often included postscripts detailing her Christian faith, adding a layer of moral reassurance. They were exchanging notes with a good, God-fearing woman. What could possibly go wrong? Men like Andrew Helgelian from South Dakota, a prosperous farmer who sold his land and withdrew over $10,000 in cash, were utterly convinced. They traveled hundreds of miles to LaPorte, Indiana, bringing with them a suitcase full of money and a heart full of hope. Upon arrival, they were often greeted by the large, smiling, imposing figure of Belle Gunness, who appeared to be everything her letters promised. The routine was always the same: a warm meal, a tour of the beautiful, isolated property, and a night of shared dreams. Then, the victim would be asked to hand over his life savings for safekeeping. Sometimes within hours, sometimes within a few days, the charade would end. Belle would execute her victim, take the money, and then send a carefully worded letter to the victim's distant family or friends, explaining that she and her new husband had suddenly decided to move to a distant, unspecified location, perhaps Texas or California, for a new business venture. The letter exchange was Belle Gunness's ultimate weapon, proving that the most effective killer does not rely on brute strength alone, but on the ruthless manipulation of human loneliness and trust. The newspaper ads were simply the first step on a very short journey to the lime pit. The LaPorte farm was not merely a backdrop for Belle Gunness's crimes. It was a meticulously engineered, self-contained murder factory. The isolation that had drawn her to Indiana provided the necessary cover, and the farm's structures, the kitchen, the barn, the pig pen were all integrated into her chillingly efficient, deadly rituals. The arrival of a new suitor, fresh off the train and clutching his life savings, would initiate the sequence. Belle's initial charm would be intoxicating, often serving her victim a lavish meal in the farmhouse kitchen. The execution, however, was rarely delayed. Belle knew that the longer a victim stayed, the higher the risk of being seen by a neighbor or their letters being tracked. The prevailing theory, supported by forensic evidence found later, suggests Belle often used poison first. A dose of strychnine or chloroform slipped into coffee or a late-night drink would subdue or kill her unsuspecting guest in his sleep. This method was quiet, efficient, and minimized the need for a struggle. For her larger victims, or those she was unable to poison effectively, blunt force was used. Accounts suggest a large meat cleaver, likely the one she used on Peter Gunness, was her secondary weapon of choice. Once the man was dead, the operation moved from the house to the outbuildings. Belle's immense physical strength, honed by years of farm work, and her formidable frame was crucial here. She was known to be capable of dragging heavy sacks of feed and moving livestock, giving her the power needed to handle human bodies. The disposal method was the most gruesome part of her established routine. Belle often dismembered the bodies, a task facilitated by her late husband Peter's butcher tools left behind in the meat house. Dismemberment was necessary to make the bodies easier to transport and, critically, to hasten their decay and concealment. The final destination for many of her victims was a small, secluded patch of the farm adjacent to the pig pen. This was a deliberate choice. The hungry, scavenging pigs were a natural, albeit crude, form of disposal that helped to remove flesh and evidence, masking the smell in the process. But the most critical tool for concealment was the lime pit. Belle would often bury the remains, sometimes with pieces of the victim's jewelry or clothing still attached, in shallow trenches. She then covered the remains not just with dirt, but with large quantities of quicklime calcium oxide. Quicklime is highly corrosive when combined with the moisture in the ground and acts to speed up the decomposition process, effectively dissolving and destroying soft tissues and bones, thereby eliminating key forensic evidence. She occasionally also used lye and other powerful chemicals. The routine was repeated dozens of times. The seductive letter, the arrival with the cash, the quiet murder, the dismemberment, and the burial under the quicklime, often near where her pigs rooted, the endless succession of husbands and farmhands who arrived with money and then vanished without a trace became a chilling, almost liturgical, act of murder for profit, all concealed by the seemingly bucolic tranquility of a modest Indiana farm. The Laporte property held the bodies of possibly 40 or more people, a mass grave masked by cornfields and the noisy appetites of a handful of farm animals. Belle Gunness's reign of terror could not have been sustained entirely by her own two hands. While she was the mastermind and executioner, the sheer volume of her victims and the constant need to dispose of bodies required help. This necessity introduced the weakest link into her operation: the farmhands and hired help who worked the Laporte property. These men became either unwitting accomplices, coerced partners, or simply more bodies to bury. The most crucial and notorious of her employees was Ray Lamphere. Lamphere was a quiet, robust, hired man who worked on the Gunness farm for years, effectively serving as Belle's strong man and handyman. He was utterly devoted to her, likely driven by a combination of genuine affection, fear, and shared secrets. Lamphere's devotion was absolute. Neighbors frequently saw him hauling heavy, suspicious sacks in the dead of night, often near the infamous pig pen area. He was widely believed to have dug the pits and helped Belle dispose of the victims, though whether he participated in the actual killing is debated. He was certainly instrumental in maintaining the silence, likely disposing of evidence and ensuring no curious eyes wandered too close to the property's secluded areas. However, Lamphere eventually shifted from a loyal accomplice to a dangerous liability. His affections for Belle were possessive, and he grew fiercely jealous of the steady stream of prosperous suitors arriving from the matrimonial advertisements. His erratic and often drunken behavior began to attract attention, and he was quickly becoming a threat to Belle's meticulously crafted public image of a respectable, pious widow. Belle, ever the ruthless pragmatist, recognized the danger. In a desperate move to sever ties and protect her secret, she attempted to have Lamphere arrested on what were likely trumped-up charges of theft. She manipulated the local sheriff, portraying Lamphere as a dangerous, obsessed brute. This betrayal, however, only pushed Lamphere over the edge. He publicly swore revenge on the woman he felt had used and discarded him. Lamphere was not the only farmhand to vanish. Several other men hired by Belle also disappeared, their names becoming lost in the long list of unidentified remains eventually found on the property. These men may have been killed because they saw too much, or simply because they, like her suitors, had amassed a small amount of savings that Belle found enticing. The Laporte farm was a place where any employee who became too curious or too rich was quickly silenced. Belle maintained her secret not just through murder, but through masterful manipulation and fear. She used Lamphere's devotion, then threatened his life. To the other workers, she projected an image of powerful, untouchable authority. Her ability to keep the local authorities at bay for so long further reinforced her control over those she employed. She was able to convince people to dig graves, move bodies, and keep silent by making them believe that opposing her was far more dangerous than helping her. The constant turnover and disappearance of farmhands became a grim, unspoken reality in the Laporte community. It was only after Lamphere was finally jailed and the farm went up in flames that his testimony, fueled by a desire for revenge, would ultimately break the decades-long silence and expose the unspeakable secrets buried deep beneath the Indiana soil. Lamphere, the loyal turned vengeful accomplice, held the key to unlocking the true terror of Belle Gunness. The secrecy that shrouded Belle Gunness' Laporte farm was violently shattered in the early morning hours of April 28, 1908. A devastating fire consumed the farmhouse, reducing the structure to a smoking ruin. When the blaze was finally contained, investigators made a horrifying discovery in the basement. 4 bodies, severely burned, yet identifiable as Belle's 3 children and a woman believed to be Belle herself. The body of the woman was headless and unrecognizable due to the damage. The local consensus immediately pointed to the enraged and recently jailed farmhand, Ray Lamphere. Authorities quickly concluded that he had set the fire to exact revenge on the woman who had betrayed him. The official narrative was simple. An obsessed man murdered a widow and her children. However, the gruesome scene was quickly overshadowed by a disturbing arrival. Asol Helgillian, farmer from South Dakota. Saul had arrived in Laporte demanding to know the whereabouts of his brother, Andrew Helgillian, who had come to the Gunness farm months earlier with over $10,000 in cash, intending to marry Belle. Andrew had vanished, and Belle's last letter claimed he had gone to Norway. Asol did not believe her. Asol Helgillian convinced the local authorities, now led by Sheriff Smutzer, to conduct a thorough search of the scorched property, specifically focusing on the disturbed ground around the Pigpennon area Ray Lamphere had mentioned in his rants. The subsequent excavation turned the Laporte farm from a fire investigation site into an unprecedented mass grave. The digging began near the hog yard and almost immediately yielded results. The first discoveries were shocking fragments: a sack containing children's clothing and shoes, followed by layers of human bone fragments, quicklime, and scraps of decomposed flesh. The horror escalated rapidly. On May 3, 1908, the workers unearthed a full, recognizable human skeleton. Beneath that, another, and then another. The grisly pattern was undeniable: shallow pits, each containing the remains of a single individual, often partially dismembered and covered with heavy doses of quicklime designed to speed decay and mask the stench. The bones were mingled with pieces of clothing, gold watches, rings, and even dentures, the pathetic remnants of men lured by Belle's promise of marriage. The media frenzy was instant and overwhelming. Reporters and morbidly curious onlookers flooded Laporte. The world watched in shocked fascination as the excavators pulled out skull after skull, counting what would eventually total 12 confirmed sets of adult human remains, in addition to the 4 found in the basement, bringing the known victim count to 16. The true number, investigators suspected, was closer to 30 or 40. The identities slowly emerged: Andrew Helgilian, the wealthy South Dakota farmer; O.B. Budsberg, a Wisconsin widower; John Moe, another Norwegian immigrant. These men were all victims of the same cruel deception, lured from their homes and buried in the soft Indiana earth. As the body count rose, so did the suspicions surrounding the identity of the headless woman in the basement. The body was far too short and light to be the famously large 200-pound Belle Gunness. The dentist brought in to examine the woman's jaw found no match to Belle's known dental records. The terrifying possibility emerged: Belle Gunness had not died in the fire. She had orchestrated the disaster, sacrificed an unknown woman, and vanished. The skeletons in the swamp had exposed her secret, but Belle herself had slipped through the net. The gruesome excavation of the Laporte farm in May 1908 quickly transitioned from a local curiosity into a massive, agonizing process of forensic identification. The initial count of bodies in the basement, the 4 charred figures, including the headless woman believed to be Belle, was immediately complicated by the dozens of body parts unearthed from the pig pen area. The victims had been mutilated, dissolved by quicklime, and decomposed over years, presenting an unprecedented challenge to the rudimentary forensic science of the era. The focus initially remained on the headless body found in the rubble, which was officially listed as Belle Gunness. However, Sheriff Smutzer and the local dentist, Dr. King, began the painful process of proving otherwise. Dr. King compared the teeth and jaw structure of the remains with existing dental records from Chicago. He delivered a shocking verdict. The dental work on the burnt torso did not match the records for the robust 200-pound Belle Gunness. This discovery meant the body was that of an unknown, smaller woman, and the killer was almost certainly alive and in hiding. Simultaneously, the sheer scale of the discovery in the pig pen was realized. The workers, under intense media scrutiny, meticulously sifted through the soil, recovering bones, jewelry, and personal effects. Each fragmented body had to be painstakingly segregated and examined. The official count of remains recovered eventually tallied 12 identifiable victims buried in the open field, ranging from complete skeletons to just a few large bones. Identifying these victims became a detective's puzzle solved through the convergence of evidence and correspondence. The primary method was matching the belongings found with the remains to the missing persons reports. The remains of Andrew Helgilian, the South Dakota farmer whose brother's insistence triggered the search, were identified by the large gold watch chain and personal papers found near his bones. This was the first clear confirmation of Belle's system. O.B. Budsberg was identified by his gold-rimmed spectacles and specific belongings found buried nearby. Other victims were identified by unique items: a pair of shoes, a gold ring, or even old coins that their families recognized from photographs or missing persons descriptions. The process painted a chilling picture of Belle's methodical work. The victims were exclusively adult men, often in their 40s or 50s, all of whom had arrived with large sums of money. The fragments of their lives: a buckle, a pocket knife, a broken tooth were all that remained of their dreams of a new life with the good woman. The realization that Belle had operated a serial murder factory for years sent shockwaves across America. She was not just a widow who killed 2 husbands. She was a predator who had lured dozens of men to her farm, murdered them, taken their fortunes, and buried them in her backyard. The total body count remains uncertain, but estimates based on the number of missing men linked to the Gunness correspondence range from 25 to over 40 victims. The LaPorte County prosecutor summarized the feeling of the nation. A seemingly respectable woman had committed the most shocking mass murders in American history. The discoveries of 1908 established Belle Gunness as arguably America's first documented female serial killer, a figure whose legacy was built on the broken bodies and shattered dreams buried beneath the soil of her quiet Indiana farm. The count was established, but the biggest question remained: where was Belle? The discovery of the mass grave beneath the pigpen confirmed Belle Gunness's horrific crimes. But the central question of the LaPorte horror: did Belle die in the fire, or did she orchestrate a brilliant escape? It remains one of the most persistent mysteries in American true crime. The controversy centers entirely on the single, headless female torso found in the smoking cellar of the farmhouse on April 28, 1908. Initial reports treated the remains as those of Belle Gunness. The narrative was tidy. The criminal had died in the flames she likely set to destroy the evidence. However, Sheriff Smutzer and the local populace who knew the infamous widow were immediately suspicious. Belle Gunness was a woman of formidable size, reliably reported to weigh over 200 pounds and stand 5 feet 7 inches tall. The remains found, once examined, told a different story. Forensic examination, rudimentary as it was, established 2 critical facts that fueled the escape theory: the size discrepancy. The torso was significantly shorter and lighter than the known physical dimensions of Belle Gunness, while the body was badly charred and distorted by heat. Experts agreed it likely belonged to a woman no taller than 5 feet 3 inches and considerably lighter than 200 pounds. The dental evidence. The key piece of evidence came from Dr. King, the dentist. Belle's local dentist was able to provide her specific dental records, which included unique gold crown work. When Dr. King examined the teeth recovered from the jawbone of the headless corpse, he declared emphatically that the dental work did not match Belle Gunness's records. The woman in the rubble was not Belle. This established the horrifying truth: Belle had executed a final, desperate crime, the murder of an unknown woman to fake her own death. The theory suggests Belle killed a female farmhand, possibly her housekeeper, dressed the body in her own clothes, beheaded it to prevent easy identification, and then set the massive fire, ensuring the corpse would be mutilated enough to discourage further forensic investigation. She then vanished into the chaos. This revelation split the nation. If the body was not Belle, where did she go? The escape theory gained credence when investigators discovered a few key details: missing assets. Belle had recently converted her substantial land holdings into cash and had withdrawn nearly all of her bank accounts just weeks before the fire. She had sufficient funds to disappear and sustain herself indefinitely. The headless strategy, the intentional removal of the head, strongly pointed to a deliberate, calculated effort to prevent identification by dental records or facial features, a classic technique for faking a death. The opposing view, held by some investigators, insisted that the intense heat of the fire could have shrunk and distorted the body beyond recognition, and perhaps the dental records were inaccurate or misplaced. They argued that the simplest explanation, that the fire, likely set by the enraged Ray Lamphere, killed Belle, must be correct. However, the weight of the evidence, particularly the dental mismatch, pointed toward a meticulously planned sacrificial stand-in. The torso in the rubble became the symbol of Belle's final, coldest act of betrayal, murdering an innocent person to purchase her freedom. The controversy of Belle's ultimate fate turned the Laporte tragedy into an American legend, confirming that the Lady Bluebeard was not only a killer, but a cunning escape artist, potentially still walking among them. As the Laporte horror unfolded in a flurry of grim discoveries, one man held the key to unlocking the true methodology and scale of Belle Gunness's crimes: Ray Lamphere. The former farmhand was already in jail, accused of setting the fire that destroyed the farmhouse and presumably killed Belle and her children. Jailed and facing serious charges, Lamphere's emotional state was a volatile mix of jealousy, vengeance, and a desperate desire for self-preservation. Initially, Lamphere maintained his innocence regarding the arson, claiming he had only been involved in minor property disputes with Belle. However, once the remains of the suitors began to surface from the quicklime-filled pits, the pressure on Lamphere intensified. The authorities and the public knew he had been Belle's constant companion, her muscle, and her most devoted servant during the years the murders took place. The full truth finally emerged in January 1909, just before Lamphere's death from tuberculosis in the Michigan City prison. Realizing he had nothing left to lose, Lamphere delivered a chilling, comprehensive jailhouse confession to his spiritual advisor and the authorities. This confession transformed him from a suspected arsonist into the single most important eyewitness to the Laporte murders. Lamphere's testimony confirmed the existence of Belle's murder factory. He described the arrival of the lonely, hopeful suitors, often detailing their names and the exact amounts of money they brought. He confirmed that Belle would first charm them, secure their assets, and then dispatch them with poison or a blow to the head, often while they slept. Crucially, Lamphere admitted his own role, detailing how Belle would then manipulate him into assisting with the body disposal. He confessed to digging the shallow graves, hauling the corpses to the pigpen area, and covering them with layers of soil and quicklime. His statement corroborated the forensic evidence found on the farm perfectly, establishing the gruesome ritual Belle employed. However, the most significant part of Lamphere's confession focused on the night of the fire and the enduring controversy over Belle's fate. Lamphere vehemently denied setting the blaze. He stated that he had seen Belle herself leave the house that night, carrying a handbag and taking a buggy, suggesting that she was the one who set the fire. He confirmed the escape theory. Belle had used the fire and the body of the headless woman as a calculated diversion to vanish. He stated that he had seen her dispose of the headless body earlier, and that she had forced the family's dentist to remove the gold crowns from the jawbone of the corpse to further confuse identification, though this detail remains controversial. Lamphere insisted that Belle was alive and had fled, Lamphere's confession, though made on his deathbed and arguably unreliable on certain self-serving points, provided the final necessary piece of the puzzle. It established the modus operandi, detailed the victim count, and most importantly, gave strong eyewitness testimony that the notorious Lady Bluebeard was not dead, but a fugitive. Lamphere died days after his confession, taking his full secrets to the grave. But his final statement cemented the idea that Belle Gunness was not a victim of her own fire, but a cunning escape artist who had traded an unknown life for her freedom. The manhunt, fueled by the desperate witness's final words, officially began. Ray Lamphere's deathbed confession, coupled with the glaring inconsistencies in the basement torsos, size, and dental records, shattered the official narrative of Belle Gunness's death. The Lady Bluebeard was no longer a victim of a vengeful farmhand. She was the most wanted fugitive in America. The hunt began immediately, transforming a regional crime story into a decades-long national obsession. The manhunt was hampered by the very nature of Belle's successful escape. She had withdrawn a substantial sum of cash, ensuring her financial independence. She had no known associates outside her victims and her dead accomplice, and her immense physical stature, while making her memorable, could also be altered through changes in weight, clothing, and hairstyle. The press capitalized on the sensational nature of the case, publishing artist renderings of Belle's stern, heavy face and disseminating her unique physical descriptors across the continent. For the next 30 years, almost any large solitary woman traveling alone with ample luggage became a potential suspect. The country was flooded with sightings. California reports emerged suggesting a woman fitting Belle's description was operating a boarding house near Los Angeles, marrying men for their money before they vanished. This sighting, though investigated, led nowhere. New York. Detectives pursued a lead that Belle had undergone plastic surgery to alter her distinctive features. A sensational theory that captured the public's imagination but lacked credible evidence. West Coast. Perhaps the most compelling, though unverified, sightings occurred in the Pacific Northwest. Police investigated claims that a large woman running a small homestead was Belle, only to find the woman was generally respectable and well settled. Authorities understood that if Belle had escaped, she would inevitably revert to her core skills, finding lonely men and collecting their money. The hunt therefore focused on tracking suspicious matrimonial advertisements, particularly those from women seeking partners, while emphasizing financial security. One of the most persistent and promising leads emerged years later in 1931 in Los Angeles. A woman named Star Carlson was arrested for poisoning her Norwegian husband to collect on his insurance policy, a modus operandi eerily identical to Belle. S. Carlson was a large, heavy-set woman who spoke Norwegian. She offered vague, inconsistent details about her past, and police noted her fierce reluctance to allow dental examination. While the evidence was circumstantial, and she died before authorities could fully establish her identity, many police officers believed they had finally captured the infamous killer. However, the evidence was never definitive, and the trail went cold once more. The pursuit was often more a matter of myth than methodical police work. Every unsolved disappearance of a lonely widower was inevitably linked to the Lady Bluebeard. The lack of a conclusive body or a reliable eyewitness. Testimony allowed Belle to exist in a permanent state of fugitive legend. She became the American boogie woman, a terrifying figure who proved that evil could wear the mask of a respectable, church-going woman. The hunt was not just for a killer. It was for closure. Despite decades of police effort, countless sightings, and international media coverage, Belle Gunness was never definitively found. Her success lay in her ability to become anonymous, using the vast, rapidly changing landscape of early 20th century America to disappear forever, leaving behind only the bones of her victims and the chilling question of her true destiny. The search for Belle Gunness eventually waned, but the gruesome discoveries on the Laporte farm left behind an unsatisfying, chilling conclusion. The most immediate physical relic of the entire affair was the headless torso found in the rubble, the body that Belle had so carefully substituted for her own. That body, officially unidentified and designated as the sacrificial stand-in, was eventually buried in an unmarked grave, symbolizing the utter lack of closure in the case. The grave belonged to an unknown woman whose murder was necessary only to facilitate the ultimate escape of America's most wanted killer. The ultimate fate of Belle Gunness became one of the country's most enduring criminal riddles. Did she meet an anonymous death years later in a distant city? Did she successfully adopt a new identity, eventually passing away in old age under a false name? The evidence strongly favors the theory of escape, supported by the dental records, the body size discrepancy, Lamphere's confession, and Belle's suspicious cash withdrawals just prior to the fire. However, without a body, police could never close the file. This lingering ambiguity cemented Belle Gunness's place in the history of American true crime, defining her icy legacy. Firstly, she is recognized as arguably America's first widely documented female serial killer who killed for profit rather than out of passion or insanity. Her crimes were systematic, organized, and financially motivated, establishing a terrifying archetype of the calculating, methodical female predator. She shattered the societal expectation that women were inherently nurturing and incapable of such brutal, large-scale violence. Secondly, the Gunness case highlighted the profound vulnerability of individuals in a rapidly expanding nation. Her victims were lonely men from across the Midwest, men seeking companionship through newspaper advertisements, a testament to the social isolation of the era. Belle exploited their loneliness and trust, using the promise of a warm home and marriage to lure them to their horrific end. Finally, the Laporte farm became a macabre landmark, a physical reminder of the darkest capabilities of human evil. The story has been the subject of countless books, documentaries, and campfire tales, focusing on the sheer scale of the atrocity. The ground Belle walked upon held the remains of possibly 40 victims, turning a seemingly ordinary Indiana farm into one of the largest single mass grave sites in American criminal history. The final resting place of the real Belle Gunness remains unknown, and that mystery is her most enduring victory. By successfully faking her death and disappearing, she denied justice to her victims' families and ensured that her legend would persist. She remains frozen in time, the cunning, ruthless Black widow who walked away from the carnage she created, leaving behind only the chilling tale of the mass grave and the solitary tragic headstone of the unknown woman who died in her place.